Science fiction, of course, relies on special effects just as heavily as fantasy to make audiences believe in things that don't really exist, from intergalactic travel to talking robots. In the 1990s, pioneering science fiction films such as Terminator 2 and The Matrix pushed the boundaries of the digital effects of their times, but there was certainly a lot farther to go. For generations, shows such as Star Trek, for example, had been forced by technological limitations into disappointingly anthropocentric representations of alien life. Captains Kirk, Picard, Sisko, and Janeway had explored the cosmos, but for some reason, all of the alien life forms they encountered just happened to have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and 1 mouth. Only the odd forehead bump, oh, I'm sorry, you can't see Worf's forehead bump, as well as pointy ears or occasional green skin tone were all that separated these so-called aliens from us humans. Meanwhile, their homeworlds all bore an odd similarity to the underwhelming collection of dusty rocks affectionately known by Star Trek fans as Planet Hell. Now, finally, CGI gave creators the opportunity to truly fulfill the mission statement laid down by Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry: infinite diversity in infinite variations. I'm sorry, in infinite combinations, IDIC for short. Instead, we've seen a different kind of spectacle dominate the box office in our imaginations. Not aliens, but instead elves and trolls. Not new galaxies, but Middle-earth. A semantic difference, perhaps. As a solitary image, a monster maybe is a monster, whether it's an alien or a Balrog. But in this decade, these spectacular images have consistently been situated within the narrative structures of fantasy rather than science fiction. And that, as I'm going to argue in a moment, is a difference that really does matter. Now, a second problem with the technological determinist argument is that it doesn't explain the success of those fantasy films that were successful and made before the era of digital effects, from The Wizard of Oz to Snow White to one of Peter Jackson's own favorites, the original King Kong. All of these films did manage to get audiences to suspend their disbelief without the so-called realism of modern CGI technology. I'd argue, in fact, that the goal of special effects realism is an always receding mirage. Every generation looks back at the visual effects of its predecessors and finds them embarrassingly cheesy. Aha, it thinks, we're too sophisticated for those clumsy old techniques, whether it's rear projection or stop motion or what have you. But as we grow more familiar with Hollywood's newest tricks, I'm confident we'll eventually start to see the seams there too. Already, if you go back and look at, say, the first Spider-Man movie, those scenes where he's swinging through the rooftops of Manhattan are starting to look embarrassingly video gamey. We've now seen enough CGI to know to look for the telltale signs, such as bodies that don't seem to be quite heavy enough. Wait a few years and I promise that even today's cutting-edge CGI will start to look just as dated. So for that reason, I think technology is an insufficient explanation. Now, a second familiar explanation for the success of fantasy in this decade is that it offers an escape from the grim realities of terrorism, war, and the threat of environmental catastrophe. At a time of crisis, the argument goes, Americans and audiences around the globe have retreated from more relevant fare to reassuring magical worlds filled with wizards, hobbits, elves, and dwarves. Exhibit A in this argument is the striking timing of the fantasy boom, which some of you may have noticed. That Christmas season of 2001 was, of course, just a few short months after the events of September 11th. As you may remember, in the weeks after 9/11, pundits debated whether Americans would still have the same appetite for violent entertainment and for such imagery as, for example, the famous shot of the White House being blown up in Independence Day. Several action films, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger's Collateral Damage, were pulled from release and rescheduled. The subsequent success of The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter that Christmas season seemed to confirm that audiences were looking for entertainment far removed from what they were watching on the nightly news. The limitation of this argument, I would argue, is the slipperiness of this concept of escapism. Certainly, we go to the movies to lose ourselves in Hollywood's dream worlds. And in times of crisis, the craving for entertainment can become even more intense. Think of the boom of glitzy MGM musicals during the Great Depression. But to call that process escape is to beg all the most interesting questions. Why do we choose the escapes we choose, musicals in the 30s, fantasy today? How do they speak to us as we sit there in the dark? And perhaps most importantly, what lasting effects might they have on us once we've returned from those momentary escapes? If we are to answer to these questions, we need to move beyond the language of escapism, along with the rhetoric of technological determinism. In the remainder of my talk today, I'd like to suggest some other explanations for the rise of fantasy and propose some ideas about what it might mean for the 21st century. So let's start by talking about the one thing that separates fantasy from all other genres, including its relative science fiction: magic. Science fiction represents the world as it could be. It relies for its premises on scientific speculation. Time travel and faster-than-light spaceships may not exist today, but technological developments could make them realities at some point in the future. Of course, it's always possible, and maybe even probable, that time travel and warp drive fundamentally violate the laws of physics and will never, ever come to pass. But that's okay, as long as writers can come up with a plausible-sounding story for how they could happen, what the actors on Star Trek always talked about as technobabble, tachyon beams and dilithium crystals. We're still in the realm of science fiction. Fantasy, on the other hand, embraces the impossible. We all know that magic doesn't exist. It lives only in fiction. If what seems to be magic turns out to be explicable through science and reason, like, for example, and I'm afraid this is probably pretty blurry, but for example, the ghosts in Scooby-Doo episodes, who almost always turn out to be creepy amusement park owners. Once that happens, once you've unmasked and it turns out there was no ghost, we're no longer in the realm of fantasy, and we're back in the real world, except for talking dogs, that is. But the fact that magic doesn't exist in our real world is exactly what makes it so potent as metaphor. Its meanings float untethered to any everyday reality. I'd like to suggest 4 different ways magic in modern fantasy functions as a metaphor for aspects of contemporary life. We'll look at magic's relationship to technology, medicine, computer programming, and finally the role of the unconscious mind. First, let's talk about magic and technology. Magic serves the role in fantasy that technology does in science fiction, and in fact the role that technology serves in real life. Magic is the fictional force that makes tools work in fantasy worlds. J.K. Rowling has a lot of fun with this in the Harry Potter novels. Ron Weasley's dad is forever amazed with the bizarre devices Muggles use to get things done instead of simply casting a magical spell to make your car fly, for example. The funny thing, though, is how little separates technology from magic in our own everyday experience of the world. Think about all the technological devices that you own: your cell phones and iPods and computers and cars and all the rest. Now, how many of them do you actually understand how they work? In an increasingly technologically complex society, we grow more and more alienated from the actual workings of our technology. And those of you who are engineering students, I apologize, maybe some of you do know, but I can promise you I couldn't begin to explain how any of the devices in my pocket right now work. Car engines are a good example. 100 years ago, you had to know your way around a car engine if you wanted to keep it running. If you check out old movies, they're constantly cranking various knobs and popping up the hood. Here's a good example. Even in my parents' generation, it was expected that you'd know what was under a car hood. And with a little study, you'd be able to develop a pretty clear understanding of what connects what to what, and what the problems might be if something goes wrong. It's all electricity and hydraulics. You can take a look and see, here's where the gasoline goes, here's where the oil goes. But in the past decade or so, or maybe 2 decades, auto repair, like so many aspects of our lives, has grown more and more computerized and less accessible to the common user. We were actually just talking in Kurt's earlier class about how computers themselves have followed this pattern. It used to be, back in the days of the TRS-80 and the Apple II, you turned on your computer and you got a C prompt, and then you'd have to type in programming language, a BASIC, in order to get anything to run. Now that was a lot harder, and it actually made it less accessible for novices. But at the same time, it meant you were a little closer to the actual machine. The graphical user interfaces of the Apple Macintosh had the advantage of being much more user-friendly. But the cost was that we lost access and understanding of what was going on in the guts of the machine underneath the graphical user interface. So, back to the example of cars. Cars today are filled with computer chips that can't be diagnosed on site the way you can spot a blown tire. When your engine light goes on, you have to take it into the repair shop, where they plug in a little electronic device which gives a repair code diagnosing the problem. This device is the intellectual property of the car manufacturer, and they only distribute it to their own dealers, which has spurred the decline of the independent repair shop as well as the amateur mechanic. A car, then, used to be an open book. Anybody could pop the engine and take a look inside and have a pretty good idea that they understood what was going on. Today it's becoming a black box, a big hunk of technology whose workings remain opaque and